Hey everybody, and welcome back to Maros for the very final time today before I get into the POV video on Christmas Eve. And basically what I'll be doing today is pretty much everything that still needs to be done. So there are a lot of things and I can't really name them all at once, but it's just generally finishing the scenery around the ride, doing lots of foliage and rockwork, doing all of these smaller path things which I haven't really done so far, like making these planters, and generally dressing up the area around the ride, because so far we just have the ride, the station, and a bit around that, but there's no real experience for the guests yet, so I kind of want to deliver on that as well. Theme the queue a little bit, and then there are some weird little odds and ends, like the Christmas tree, which might happen at some point in this episode. The lake pier thing, which I just sort of decided to do on a whim, because there wasn't much else there, and finishing everything off with a weenie, pretty much, which is gonna be a hut that sits on top of a mountain. I know it sounds very lame, but that's something which hopefully should be a pretty good way to close this series and get to the very final video. And after that, of course, I'll return to your regularly scheduled Planet Coaster videos, but this is basically almost the last of this sort of special Christmas week here. Now, one of the first things that I want to quickly comment on is actually that I found this way. Well, it's very simple really, but I found this way to make like hanging Christmas lights. One of the things which always kind of bugged me about the lights which they added into the game, no matter how good they are, because I am very happy that these have been added into the game, but what kind of bugged me about them is that they're made to be placed on buildings, they're made to be hung from buildings and on the side of like roof trims and things like that, which is beautiful. It's a very Christmassy thought, but it's not the kind of thing that you can hang around, in the sense that many Christmas decorations are just kind of strings of lights and strings of flags and stuff like that, just decorations that sort of are placed on top of what is normally there. So it's things like these strings of lights, which I decided to put in between the lanterns, which I wanted to focus on. Things that, you know, the entire coaster would still look good if you take away the Christmas decorations. Like, the Christmas decorations aren't anything that substantially makes the ride. They just sort of had to feel like additions that were just sort of thrown in there for the Christmas season. Which is kind of why I'm, wanted to hang these things from lanterns and put them next to trims on buildings instead of making everything revolve around them. So that was just that very quick thing, and I'll be recycling a lot of those things as well. So here I'm just taking the same strings. I've got like 3 strings of lights at this point, like a long, a short, and a medium one, and that should hopefully be just about good enough to have the few strips that I want to have here and there. And on this side, pretty much I did the same. A couple of lanterns, few lights in between. I'm not sure, like, how happy I am with this side. I originally thought it might be really cool to have a small snack bar or something like that on this side. There just isn't enough time to do that, so it's really just some basic, standard kind of detailing. Bunch of rocks and foliage here, and then the path elements. And I'm not too sure how much I do like that, but at least it gives a finished sense to the area, and I definitely didn't want to make anything that draws attention to itself, because for this entire area the station is the only thing that's gonna want to draw attention. So I didn't want to put anything in there that would block the line of sight or be something more interesting to look at. Now at this point we're moving toward the place where I'll be adding a pier in a little bit, but not quite yet. I first actually wanted to get into more decorations of places. So at this point I'm just very quickly finishing off the shrubs here and there, and then I wanted to get into more lighting and detailing. So what I'm doing over here is adding a couple of lights next to these posts that I already had, because I think I mentioned this in the last episode. I had those separate light posts which I need for the spotlights, and then I also had real light posts on the side of that, which didn't make a lot of sense. So instead I'm now using the spotlight posts as regular light posts as well. And the tunnel over here, which is absolutely overcrowded at this point, it should be much better in the future. I don't know why it was this bad at this point, but usually it's not this crowded. But anyway, this tunnel needed a couple of lights, so I made a quick ironwork light kind of thing to copy paste around there. And then I also wanted to have another kind of light that I could use on the side that's a little bit smaller. So there's yet another unique light. I wanted to make a couple extra small ones for the side there, and then for the queue I'm making yet another one, so that every area has its own kind of unique lights and things like that. I've talked about this times and times before, but for me, adding these little differences in details is super important. Not reusing the fence, like the same fence all over the park, not reusing the same benches and the same lights all over the park for me is a super important thing. Like even in a small space, it adds a lot more character to whatever you're making. If you're switching up the items which you're using, it just takes away all the atmosphere if you see the same fence around the plaza all over like the entire area. It's just much more fun to have all of these different types, which is why I made that abundance of different lights over there. It wasn't too much work though. Most of them just take the template of a light which I built and just kind of add or subtract some things to it. Or add some things to it or subtract from it. And here I also wanted to finish the building which I have for the queue, where it just zigzags for a little bit. This is actually a bit Baron 1898. I am sorry about the pronunciation for all of you non-Dutch people, but it's a bit like it, since it also has that queue where it really winds around and has a couple of places where it actually snakes, which you do see more often, but I wanted to have this mix of having it snake somewhere, then, or at least having the path kind of flow through a landscape, then having a small building where it snakes, and then having it flow through a landscape again, so that you can actually make the most out of the area, because there's quite a neat area over there, like having the coaster overhead, and having the lake, and some mountains on the sides. It felt like a too nice area to just put the queue in a small space and put buildings around it. And instead I wanted to make sure that you actually see the entire surroundings of the queue. So that's why I wanted to make it as open as I really could here. Besides, queues are super important. They're arguably one of the most important things in a theme park, because on any busy day that you're gonna get your most guests. Most guests are also gonna spend most of their time inside a queue. So you better make them part of the experience, which is really the most important thing about queues. So with that almost out of the way, I just wanted to add all of the railings in this building. Actually use some different railings in here as well. I felt it would become a bit too dense and boring if I used that same balustrade all over the place. So I decided to switch it up a bit with these very small unique posts, which I had on the other side of the station as well. And that more or less finishes that building. Only thing that I still wanted to add at this point are some lanterns and a few planters, or hanging plant baskets, stuff like that, to dress it up a little bit, make it a bit more cozy. But it's really the placement of this building which I felt is most important. You'll definitely see in the final video how it's gonna work out exactly, but I just felt like it would be a beautiful thing to have this very small pond with this queue building next to it, the coaster on the other side, and then in the distance having all of the hills. Might not make too much sense right now, but there are some pretty cool and interesting sightlines that I wanted to make use of with this queue. Now, something which, well, turned out to be like the big time-consuming thing, and actually a pretty large part of this video, is just finishing up all of the foliage and all of the rockwork in this park, which I was kind of getting comfortable with at this point. Like, I've already done a couple of smaller areas, so there's already kind of a system as to how I'm doing it. It's really very similar to what I've done to Mjolnir, and what I've basically always been doing. Start with the rocks first, kind of lay those out in some areas, especially where you feel like they would start to clutter. So at the bottom of these hills, and especially in these little valleys, but also some of these rocks on top of these hills, make it look a bit more interesting. It doesn't all have to be extremely realistic. And after that, get into some of these smaller shrubs, like the green shrubs that I'm placing over here. I wanted to sink them into the ground low enough so they would look like they aren't entirely covered with snow anymore, or at least their bottom is kind of covered with snow. At least I didn't want them to stand out. I just wanted to use them to add a bit of color to these areas, because obviously with the white snow and the white snow covered pine trees, there isn't a lot of colors to go for anymore. So it kind of helps with that. And then the second bush that I'm using a lot here is again that desert kind of bush, which looks a lot like dry grass, but definitely helps to blend everything together. And it's a beautiful little piece of foliage that you can even use as filler in some places. Like some of these places where it's just open snow and nothing else, I sometimes just like to place these things as if there were a lot of weed over there, something like that. Now, interestingly, I also wanted to keep like these terrace looking rocks quite open and not place too many trees. I think a very easy pitfall to fall into, and definitely one that I've fallen into a lot as well, is the urge to fill every single open space that you have with trees. Like everything that's still empty feels like it needs to be filled in with trees sometimes. I don't know if how many people would feel this way, but I've definitely seen a lot of people struggle with this or talk about this a lot. And I think it's actually really important to just leave some areas open sometimes, just not place any trees in there. Maybe fill it up a little bit with bushes and rocks to make it not completely empty, but at least, you don't really notice the forests if there are only trees. Basically, there is a Dutch saying, which I don't know if it translates well into English, but it's like, you can't see the forest anymore through the trees, and you need like some open space to actually still like have the forest stand out. Anyway, I am massively behind the video again. I am working on the quick pier over here, which is something that I wasn't really planning to do beforehand. It just kind of felt like something I did on a whim. The reason for it was kind of that this part of the ride of the coaster otherwise felt very disconnected from the rest of the ride. It goes over the lake, but there's no real incentive to go to this part of the park if there were no path, because there's no ride over here. There isn't a bridge or something over the lake. That would have been stupid anyway. Basically, it kind of felt like a desperate little zone that's just completely empty and where just the coaster came. So I wanted to connect it a bit and also have a bit of interaction with the path over here. So I decided to make this little pier. I'm not sure if I'm really gonna do anything like connect a boat to it or something. That's something that I'll have to decide in the end. But the basic premise is not really to be a functional pier, but really to be a part of the scenery, to be part of the layout, and interact with the coaster a bit more, make this entire scene a bit more interesting. So the coaster passes very close by this thing, and you have to imagine that, you'll have to be able to have some benches, some areas where you can sit on top of this pier and just have this beautiful place where you can look at a coaster. Because honestly, I'm that kind of person, and I know a lot of people are like this as well, where just looking at a coaster alone is just amazing, and nothing hurts me more than a coaster which completely shuts itself off from any and all paths and is only visible from the coaster itself. Unless it's an indoor coaster, but you get the point. Basically, I want to put it on the showcase as much as I can here. And then the sides of the lake, I sort of wanted to detail the lake the most on the side where you can actually see it from very up close on the side of the pier, and the other side I just wanted to put a bunch of simple rocks, bunch of trees, and leave it at that. So you can kind of see the level of detail and the amount of details that I put in. It get lower and lower as you get further away from the coaster, which is definitely a very basic tip, but something very important as well to keep in mind. There are too many people who have seen placing bushes on the other side of the map than where you actually see anything, which is a waste of polies and a waste of your time, so it's definitely something that I would avoid, and I generally go less detailed as you go further away from the point where you actually see everything. Also, to save a bit of time, I saved a blueprint over here, which is something that I definitely recommend anyone doing. If you have a large space to fill with trees, just place a couple of them, make a blueprint out of it, and you can save yourself a lot of time in the long run. There are so many things which blueprints are amazing for. And at this point I feel like the ride is really coming together, especially from the lake. It has an almost finished look to it. I just had this unfinished corner which still didn't have any rocks and foliage, and then there's the area with the station, but it doesn't really impact the look of the ride that much. So this was the first thing that I wanted to tackle and actually finish this area over here, where again I wanted to leave some open spaces, but not necessarily because I didn't want to fill everything with forests, but also because there are some sightlines that I feel are very important over here that I wanted to preserve at all costs. So the first one is from the queue, just before you enter the little roof building on the queue. If you look over the lake, there's going to be this open place where there aren't any trees blocking the view, and then in the distance you can see this rock looming up basically. The same kind of goes from the main path as you approach the station from the park entrance. You'll actually be able to see this rock kind of loom up in the distance between the station and the loop of the coaster. So I wanted to keep that sightline open as well, so there aren't too many trees around there, but it's definitely a very important place, and it's gonna be much more important once I add the weenie on top of it. But before that, there's still a lot of detailing to do. So the first thing that I wanted to do here is work a bit on the general area for the path, which is not too interesting. Just, you know, it's an unfinished area, there aren't any trees or any scenery, so I wanted to fix that. But what is interesting is that this is also where I built my quick Christmas tree. I didn't want to go over the top. The guests are absolutely going bonkers for that little path over there, but I didn't want to go over the top for the Christmas tree. I just wanted to have a few decorations in there, but not just, you know, populate it too much with all of these Christmas bells and stuff. So it's quite simple, but I did want to use an in-game regular tree and then decorate it myself so that there's still a few of those snow coverings, and at least to give it a bit of a personal touch. I personally do like red decorations. I don't know why people even have silver decorations in Christmas trees, it's just too colorless. Like, what are you even doing? So I wanted to have some colorful decorations in here. Generally, I'm just switching it up between two types of the Christmas balls. I don't know what you actually call them in English. And then there's the Christmas bells, and of course the star on top. And of course some big presents at the bottom, like really huge presents. So that should give a pretty cool festive kind of atmosphere to this entire area, I suppose. There will of course be other kind of decorations. You know, like these rocks, the foliage, but also barrels, any kind of thing that you might see stored around areas like this. But it's the Christmas thing, and the Christmas tree, and the Christmas decorations, and of course presents that I feel make it the most Christmas kind of atmosphere. So that's the most important part, I would say, of the detailing here. Now with that out of the way, all that was still left to do is foliage, but that's boring. So let's skip ahead and go into the very final thing of this video, which is the hut on top of the hill. Now I want to say I wanted to keep this as simple as I could because I didn't have that much time left at this point, and well, I also just recycled the parts that I made earlier on, and at this point I basically saved every custom made modular piece that I made, so I have a pretty solid collection of different custom Russian pieces at this point. And all I still had to do is just put these things together in a modular kind of sense. There actually wasn't that much work, because most of the work for this building has already been done up front in making these custom pieces. So it's a very simple hut. I just put the roof pieces together that I already had. The only thing that I wanted to do with this thing that was slightly more complicated is the onion tower. And I got so many requests to do this kind of thing. I actually considered it right from the start, from episode 1. You've got like these famous Russian onion and bell towers with these spiraling colors, you know, like you see on many Russian landmarks. And it's something that you definitely see in some of these more traditional, smaller wooden huts as well. Especially in theme parks, it's a very fancy addition. I was just very afraid of making these things, since, you know, they're onion towers, and they're one of the hardest things to make, if not the hardest things to make custom when it comes to spires. So in the end I just decided to go for a very small one that fits the simple wooden outback kind of atmosphere of the build, and make it in a simple way as well. Just make one outline and copy that into the shape that I need, and that is basically it. And that is also more or less it for this episode. So, I really want to thank you guys for watching this, and I want to thank you guys for watching this entire series. It's been awesome. Have a Merry Christmas, and if I don't see you anymore, a Happy 2017 as well, and stay tuned for the POV video. See you later, guys.